All right. Hi. This is Mr.
Hello.
Hi. My name is Mr. Menifee, and this is Forensic Science for University High School. And I am here with Mr. Clif Watts with the Health and Human Services Commission. So, Mr. Watts, if you'll go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and just to kind of get us started and what do you do, and then we'll kind of follow up with some additional questions.
Sure. Well, as Mr. Menifee said, my name is Clifton Watts. I've known Mr. Menifee for probably about 20 years now. My career started in the prison system with the University of Texas Medical Branch as a mental health case manager, where I worked in intellectually disabled prison population system where essentially we ensured their well-being and that they were being properly cared for. From there, I moved to Child Protective Services, where I did a number of things from investigations to family-based safety services to conservatorship to adoptions to foster home development, a number of things there. And in 2014, I moved over to Adult Protective Services, which was at the time under a different umbrella agency. I won't go into that because you probably won't care about that. But essentially, I began my career with what I'm currently doing in facility investigations. And then in 2018, I was promoted to supervision, where I'm now currently a program manager for the long-term care regulatory department for the Health and Human Services Commission. And what I do is run a unit of investigators in now 34 counties in the Northeast District of Texas, which is now Region 3, which is essentially everything from the county that I live in all the way north to Arkansas and kind of around the Dallas Metroplex. And we have investigators that go into thousands of different types of facilities around the state, which range from state supported living centers to state hospitals. Now we're doing assisted living facilities and nursing homes, as well as group homes that are located in the community, homes that may be near you that you may not even know exist. So we investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation in those types of homes and situations.
Okay, so we just covered a whole lot of stuff. So
Yeah.
really simply, what is Adult Protective Services and kind of what is the role of Adult Protective Services in the state of Texas under the Health and Human Services?
Well, just to clarify, I'm no longer with Adult Protective Services.
Oh, okay.
They were separated in 2014 when they expanded the scope and jurisdiction of our department. So we were formerly part of Adult Protective Services, but now that is under a different umbrella agency called the Department of Family and Protective Services, where Child Protective Services and all that are located.
Okay, and so what y'all mostly do with the Health and Human Services is that you investigate cases of alleged abuse, and then what else?
Abuse, neglect, and exploitation of a very specific population of people that are deemed individual receiving services in the state of Texas. So essentially, anyone in Texas that has a medical or mental or physical disability that has a licensed provider that cares for them, my unit of investigators investigates any allegations, whether valid or not. We determine that or try to determine that for those individuals in our coverage area.
Okay, so could you walk me through like a mock case? So
Sure.
let's say someone calls the hotline. I'm assuming there's a hotline.
Right.
So do you know the hotline number off the top of your
Sure.
head? Okay.
1-800-252-5400.
Okay, so I'm calling in and I'm saying, hey, my grandma is in an assisted living facility and I think they are being abusive to her because grandma, she always looks really rough. So I call, and then where do we go from there?
Well, you actually started at a very good point because it kind of starts at the intake, and it depends on what is said in the intake. We can go with as little information as Miss Dorothy so-and-so lives in this facility and she has a scratch above her right eye.
Okay.
Sometimes we get allegations that are that vague. So at that point, the statewide intake worker, which they take in hundreds of thousands of allegations every year,
Wow.
sends it to the appropriate regional coordinator or the person who routes cases. And then that router or person who receives that intake notifies the facility that there's been an intake of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and that they are then charged with protection of that individual, which they're already in charge of protection, but they have to provide special protection for that individual until the investigation can be concluded. So
Okay.
one of my investigators will then go to that facility within a certain time period to initiate the case and kind of just start the investigative process. I don't want to go too far. I'll let you kind of ask questions.
Okay, so yeah, and I appreciate that. So does it have to be an anonymous call? Do they have to give their information? Is it a, hey, such and such, I think somebody's beating
Yeah.
up on old people here, someone's, and this is
That can also vary. It can
okay.
be like if you call, there are certain people who are required to call. Educators are one of those people. Any kind of social worker, any kind of myself, if I become aware of any sort of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, law enforcement, those types of people, and those people are not typically allowed to be anonymous. That
Okay.
being said, we always protect our reporters. So if Mr. Menifee calls and says, "Hey, I know about this abuse, but I also have my boss also works at this facility, and I don't want to get in trouble."
Yeah.
We're not going to call the facility and say, "Hey, Mr. Menifee called this report in." We're not there, and we do get asked that all the time. "Hey, who called this in?" And we are very well trained to say, "Sorry, I can't tell you that." And we typically give the same response to them as, we would protect your identity if you had reported something as well. So,
Yeah.
but we do get anonymous calls as well from the community,
Okay.
some valid and some not.
So does it just be so some of our other victims might be, like we said, people in retirement facilities, people under nursing home care, also young adults or any adults who is suffering a mental disability.
Right,
So someone with Down syndrome or one of the other like major mental physical things that
right.
requires constant care, requires regular care. So
Anyone in a state facility. So, like if you had a relative that lived in your home that required care, that would not come to us. That would go to Adult Protective Services.
okay,
But yes,
so
we
you're
have
all
we investigate cases with babies that fall into the categories of our investigation, all the way up to the extreme elderly.
okay. So it's really more about the state run or the state accredited facilities.
And their personal characteristics,
And
the
they're
individual's personal characteristics.
okay. All right. So we've called the hotline. Someone's recorded the information. Someone is going to, are you going to send someone to go check on this individual, or is it going to be a phone call first? How does that work?
Well, it depends. It depends on the case. Especially with COVID now, we do the majority of our work is done virtually.
Okay.
If any case of physical or sexual abuse, we are going in person to those facilities to initiate the case, just to make sure that everything's on the up and up, and that
Okay.
appropriate care and protections are provided to that individual.
So physical abuse means you're going to show up no matter what.
It depends on the physical abuse, and it also depends on the individual, because we have people who we consider chronic callers. We get a lot of state hospital calls of people saying that the staff cut their head off, but
Oh,
they're calling the case in, so we're pretty certain that the individual's head has not been cut off. But in those cases, even we still are required to do a FaceTime interview or some sort of virtual interview where I can see Mr. Menifee's head is completely attached to his shoulders and there are no injuries.
okay. So I guess the other question that goes along with this, what if I'm reporting a staff member who's being abusive, but I don't have a particular, like, I keep hearing that, Nurse Johnson keeps coming around. He smells like whiskey and he keeps whacking Mr. Thomas up in the face. And that's why Mr. Thomas's face is blue all the time.
Yeah, we get a lot of what we call multi-level cases, which that would include what you just mentioned would be a neglect and physical abuse allegation. In those types of cases, we would probably go out to the facility just to make sure that that individual's face is not black and blue. We would also pull, we have access legally to any document in the state of Texas. So it's sometimes hard to get, but let's say you're under investigation for exploitation of an individual. I have legal access to your banking records to show deposits, withdrawals, and all that stuff. And that comes from the Texas Human Resource Code. There's lots of administrative codes that apply
So you
to
can
our
basically,
power.
so
What?
if you're investigating someone for abuse case, or you're trying to, let's say, elder abuse, and you're like, hey, this elder thinks their money's being taken, then you have
Right.
legal ability
Oh yeah.
to access not only their medical records, their HIPAA records, but also
Anything we need.
anything you need. So
Yep.
internet search history to
Everything.
how many.
We don't even need a subpoena.
Wow. So now this is kind of going off topic. So would that leave your investigators open to being co-opted by other investigators? Because I do know that one of the things we see in federal financial crimes is the co-opting of U.S. postal inspectors, because the mail fraud rule is so easy to apply to everything. You're like, if you committed a crime, you probably also committed mail fraud. You just don't need to do it yet.
No, we have very strict standard operating procedures. We can share information with law enforcement, but we cannot share information with any other entity in the state of Texas. So if Child Protective Services calls me and says, I need this information, I can't give it to them. They would have to get a subpoena or go through the court system, because all of Child Protective Services orders are mandated by the court. They have no individual power themselves other than exigent powers.
Okay. All right. So we've called you. You're sending your investigator out to check on our individual who said they've been bruised or beat up by the staff. Okay. Investigator shows up. How does that work? Does the investigator go straight to the victim? Do they check in with the front office first? How's all that?
Well, it kind of depends on the case, and it's up to the investigator. When I was an investigator, I would tell you that my first priority is getting my eyes and my mind on that victim. So we have between 24 hours and 72 hours. I'm sorry, that's not true. 24 hours and 7 days, depending on the case, to see an individual. So if an injury is alleged, that's going to be a high priority intake, or P1 as we call it. I have 24 hours to talk with you. So that's going to be my first priority. That stops the timeline of my case. I can have as much time as I want after that, but I have to see you within 24 hours.
So I call in, say the orderly pushed me down the stairs, that's why my hip is broken. Then
that 24 hours.
That person makes the call, that clock is ticking.
Yep. That's when it starts ticking.
From the time where it's assigned the investigator, but from the time the call is placed.
Yes, correct. The time that is received by statewide intake.
Okay. All right. So your investigator has come out. They're now talking with the victim, or I'm sorry, the alleged victim or the person who's placed the call. So what are some questions that they're going to ask?
Obviously that could range depending on the case, but essentially,
let's go kind of broad on the questions. Kind of give me a broad, like you think the investigator might think there's some other things going on. So let's go for kind of a broad shotgun effect.
We try to avoid any sort of leading question. So I'm not going to say, hey, you said that your staff member pushed you down the stairs and broke your hip. Is that right? That would be a leading question that, they could be of such a mental state. They're going to say, yeah, I remember saying that or whatever. That doesn't really give me anything. And it also kind of messes up the case. So I typically just go in there and introduce myself and say, hey, I'm here to check on you, see how things are going. I see you have an injured hip. Can you tell me how that happened? And kind of let them walk me through what I already know from the intake.
Okay. So it's less about, hey, this is what you reported, and not having confirmation bias, but having, hey, I'm just giving you all the information. I'm here. Tell me what happened.
This is what I do. This is who I am. This is who I work for.
Tell me what happened.
And then just kind of let them lead the conversation there. Because typically if something is valid or something really happened, they're going to know exactly why you're there, and they're just going to start spilling the beans and talking to you about it.
Okay.
Unless they're of a mental state that they just can't do that. We get a lot of nonverbal cases.
And how do you deal with a nonverbal case? And give me an example. What would be a nonverbal case? Like, what kind of
Okay. Sure.
patient would you see for a nonverbal case?
Sure. We have a lot of nonverbal cases, so it's pretty easy to give you. But essentially, we have many different types of evidence, which I'm sure y'all probably talked about the different types of evidence in your class. But we have testimonial evidence of people who have witnessed certain allegations or certain events that have taken place. In the nonverbal cases, it's most often a staff member or someone at the facility that noticed something that wasn't right. So there are certain types of bruises on people that are normal. So like your toddler, it's common for them to have bruises around their shins and their elbows and just commonplace like that. But it's not common for them to have bruises on their abdomen and their back and torso. So the same is true for an elderly person in most cases. However, they do bruise easier. But if there are bruises or broken bones, or sometimes in nonverbal cases, just utterances of pain. So you can tell that they're in pain and you can't figure out why. And then you discover, oh my gosh, they have a broken femur or something to that effect. It's happened quite often. But we begin the case by.
Pause real quick.
Go ahead.
Guys, just to clarify,
Yeah.
if you do not remember where the femur is the upper leg bone. Okay. It's the
Right.
bone that you've got a right femur, a left femur. These are the ones that are in between your hips and your kneecap. So it's the big, thick,
Very strong bone.
very incredibly strong bone, but it tends to get weaker in older individuals due to calcium and osteoporosis. I'm sorry, calcium loss and osteoporosis. Sorry, continue on.
And this is a real case that I'm kind of reflecting on to answer. So
Okay.
I can kind of tell you a little bit about that and the outcome at the end. But in those types of cases, I generally have my investigators start with injury reports. So they would pull all injury reports for the past 6 weeks, and they would look for falls, or they would look for anything that happened that might explain the injury. Because not all injuries are abuse and neglect, but some are. But our ultimate goal is not to make sure we get somebody in trouble. It's to make sure that the individual is properly cared for. So if we can't ask questions to the individual, sometimes nonverbal doesn't mean non-communicative. So I've had hundreds of cases where the individual is fully with it in their brain. They just can't articulate verbally what happened or whatever. So that's my first task, is figuring out, are they nonverbal or are they non-communicative?
And so that would be something like someone's had a stroke where
Right.
their mental abilities are still there, but they can no longer
They can't tell you, hey, he pushed me.
tell you the specifics.
Yeah. And sometimes those people use identification charts or communication charts where they can point to certain things. And we have a common set of those, which kind of very plain pictures where someone who knows they were pushed down could point to the picture of someone pushing someone, just to kind of give you a lead as to the direction of the story and which way it went.
Okay.
But more often than not, a lot of our cases they're completely non-communicative. So we're working off of evidence that's obtained not from the individual that's injured.
Okay. All right. So you've had your interview. They've given some indication that it was not an accident, that there's some sort of abuse going on. What's the next stage? Do you interview the staff? Do you interview other patients or other individuals at the facility? How does that work?
A little bit of all of that. But after we speak to the individual that has been injured or the allegation is pertaining to, that's typically where we take a step back and we start collecting documents.
Okay.
A great majority of our cases are proven in the paperwork. So a lot of times the staff will document, hey, this person fell at this time. They're required to document those types of things. Sorry, my ice machine is beeping behind me.
Oh, like, is it hot pocket time?
It is always hot pocket time. But so after we collect documentation and review that documentation, then we do broad interviews. So I will interview all of the staff that worked on that shift for however much time that I want to cover. And then I'll interview professionals. So I'll go interview doctors about the injury and say, hey, what ways could this injury be caused? So in the case that I was referring to, it was a spiral fracture of the femur, which you see a lot in toddlers, oddly enough, or not a lot, but it's one of the common breaks in toddlers. But we'll ask questions of the professional to determine whether or not the injury could have been caused without abuse and neglect.
Yeah.
Sometimes the professional will say, no, there's no way that that break occurred without someone doing something inappropriate.
Because so a spiral fracture is basically the fracture line looks twisted. So kind of like if you took, well, I'll take this straw and hopefully not get Coke on my laptop. Is basically it's that
Yes.
twisting motion.
Correct.
And so so a lot of times it'd be someone's planted a foot and they've been pushed, and it's going to cause that twisting kind of snap motion in there. And the reason you see it on toddlers is because they're toddlers and they get into everything.
Right.
I kid you not. I swear my own 3-year-old is due for some sort of injury at some point in the near future, even though my wife's pointing at me and telling me don't say things like that right now. But because she just likes to climb everything.
Right.
So, okay. So you've talked, you've interviewed. It's showing that it's probably a clear sign of abuse. What's the next step?
Well, I should have mentioned this too. We also collect photographic evidence. So my unit of investigators has very specific parameters for investigation. So we do not collect physical evidence.
Okay.
If a case requires physical evidence, there's most likely going to be law enforcement involved. So if anything, we safeguard the physical evidence. So in a rape case, we would safeguard the clothing so that law enforcement can obtain it and get it tested.
Now you're still taking photos of everything.
Correct.
Beforehand.
I would take pictures of the clothing.
Okay, so just because we covered a little bit of this year, but this year's been a kind of a strange year.
Yeah,
Do
sure.
you all follow the rule of 3 for photo?
Yes. Yes. So
Okay.
we start by getting a broad picture of the environment. So if I was taking a picture of an individual, for example, I would back up and I would get their complete body in the picture, and then I would go to a torso up picture, and then I would zoom in on their face or whatever, maybe the injury, just to show that the pictures that I took close up are the same individual that I took far away. And same for an environment. You want to make sure that all of the evidence is good.
Now, are y'all using, is it the general rule that we've kind of noticed with some law enforcement is use your camera, a real camera if you got one, but if you don't, use your cell phone, just make sure you're uploading it to a secure website and you're not sharing the stuff. What's the general rule for y'all?
For our unit, we are, in fact, even the law enforcement for the state OIG are required to use their state operated iPhones, but they're very well protected iPhones. They're not your typical iPhones. Like, I mean, you can't download any sort of apps.
Multi-level encryption.
There's 3 levels of encryption on the phone, so it's very secure. But and it automatically uploads to my computer and deletes from my phone as soon as I take the picture and as soon as my computer is hooked back up to the internet. So
okay, so
you go take 1,000 pictures and then I come home to start typing on my case and put my phone next to my computer. I don't have to do anything. It's automatically putting it on my computer, and all I have to do is sort it later and put it where it needs to go.
Okay, so just basically, hey, this is the case file it needs to go into.
Yep.
Okay, so you've taken your photos, you've interviewed the client or victim. What's the term y'all use?
All of them. Well, we use individual receiving services is how we refer to the victims.
Okay, so we've interviewed the individual receiving services, we've documented the injury wound, and everything that's accompanying of that. You've collected the paperwork.
If there's any video, we pull video and review that, which is in a lot of our facilities, there's always video.
Okay.
And then after that, we use what we call a T-chart to weigh the evidence. So typically we write for and against and a line down the middle, and we have a little neutral section down bottom for, let's say, a collateral witness who really, he might know the individual and he might know the alleged perpetrator, but he doesn't really know anything about the incident. They would be a neutral witness. So they don't really have anything to say that the incident occurred or did not occur. They just have supporting evidence to show that that staff member has a short temper, or that individual lies a lot, or things of that nature, which can be used in our cases to make a determination. But more often than not, we try to use weighted evidence, which is for or against the allegation occurring.
not just
And
kind of background evidence, like
right,
actual, hey, this is determinative evidence.
right.
Okay, so
And go ahead.
so at no point are you quote unquote taking physical evidence. You're just
Right.
documenting everything. So who comes in to take the physical evidence if physical evidence needs to be taken?
It depends on the case and the facility. A lot of our state, or all of our state operated facilities, the HHSC, our counterparts, law enforcement, is the Office of Inspector General. So we worked side by side with them. The only difference is they are law enforcement officers and we are not. We are administrative investigators. So
So
if an
with
arrest needs to happen, they do that.
okay, so basically you're the guys without the guns doing investigations, and then you call OIG, Office Inspector General, and they're the guys with the guns who can physically arrest, and then y'all work together to see that the charges are filed and that it's taken to either a court or a grand
Right.
jury or
And we may
whatever.
testify in the case or whatever.
Or there's
Um,
okay,
yeah. So we typically, or actually in most cases, if a serious allegation comes in, we notify the Office of Inspector General and they make a determination at the front end of the case whether or not they want to open their own investigation.
okay,
We don't close ours if they open one, but we're technically investigating two different things. They're investigating a crime and we're investigating an allegation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, which could be a crime, but it may also not rise to a criminal level, which is a lot of our cases.
okay.
So if I'm trying to think of an example, well, in the case that I was referring to, which I haven't told you exactly what happened yet,
Oh, go ahead
um,
and finish that one then.
yeah, the elderly gentleman that I was referring to with the spiral fracture of the femur, it turns out we reviewed video and we heard what sounded like a very loud gun going off in his room, which was the sound of a bone breaking. I don't know if you've ever heard a bone break, but it's a very loud noise depending on the bone. But that kind of narrowed us down to the time of the incident.
Okay,
And we also saw the staff leave. That there are no cameras in the individuals' rooms, but there's
yeah,
cameras outside of the individuals' rooms for privacy reasons. But the staff came out of the room in a panic. Um, so we knew that something had occurred around that time period. And we also heard he was a nonverbal individual. We also heard him starting to moan and scream. So we knew that he was in pain because it was not common to him. That's one of the things we determined with our collateral witnesses, that he
yeah.
doesn't yell out in pain for no reason. Um, and from that point, we re-interviewed that staff that we had already interviewed, and they informed us that while changing the gentleman, they had to turn him, and when they turned him, they heard a loud pop in his leg, and that's what caused the break. That's not illegal. He didn't do anything illegal, but he did neglect the individual because he did not report it, and he didn't document that he heard the loud pop. He didn't even get assistance for that individual. So
I mean, the guy could
actually,
have,
a very serious case on our end, but
yeah.
it doesn't rise to a criminal level.
So it's more of a the guy's going to lose his job.
Oh no, he's going on what we call the employee misconduct registry, which is the most serious of our cases.
Okay,
Um, Certain types of injuries, any bone breakage or neglect or failure to render aid, essentially. So essentially, he knew this guy was hurt, and he just kind of walked away from the situation, and the guy just left the guy in pain
yeah,
because he was scared,
yeah.
and it happens a lot.
Wow.
Um,
They hurt somebody. They're not sure what they're supposed to do, or they,
well, well, that's another thing that we have to determine.
yeah,
One of the documents that we always pull is a training record. So we established that that staff member was trained on those specific things to know what they should have done. And in this case, if that staff had gone to the nurse and said, "Hey, I was changing Mr. So and so, and I heard a loud pop when I was changing him, and he seems like he's hurting," nothing would have been done to that individual, to that staff member, and that's how it should be, because he would have done the right thing.
and then care could have been administered. But
Exactly.
for my students who don't know this, if you break a bone that large, you could have an issues with blood clots
Oh yeah.
or with a stroke. I mean, there's a lot of issues. Like,
Right.
don't just like we wouldn't let you like, oh, you got a broken leg, walk it off. No, you don't do that
Right,
because there's a lot of other secondary issues that can happen that are much, much worse than
right.
a broken bone.
And that's one of the things that, so as investigators, we are not allowed to use our own judgment or common sense. So I might know what you just said,
Yeah,
but I have to get a professional to tell me that.
yeah,
And you would be surprised at how many times that's hard to do because a professional doesn't want to say one way or the other what the right thing to do is because they have a license on the line too.
yeah.
But in this particular case, the individual required surgery to fix and secure the bone in his leg. So I really didn't need too much more than that to get them on the employee misconduct registry.
Okay. All right. So we've got a case of elder. I wouldn't call it abuse, but elder neglect. Is that word it'd be classified under?
That's what that case would be. Well, it came in as physical abuse, but we changed it to neglect.
Elder neglect. Okay. So since you said you work for state facilities, do you investigate cases at like the state juvenile corrections as well?
No, that would be there is an administrative wing of the Office of Inspector General that would do that. We don't go into any units of incarceration.
Okay. So can you give us an example of like, let's say you have a younger victim, let's say a victim under 20 or even younger. Where would you encounter this victim? And, so what kind of facility would you be going into?
Various. It could be a group home in the community, or it could be most often for younger kids. It would be we have a lot of like I don't even know how you would classify them. We call them Hickses. Essentially, home health for babies with serious medical issues.
So like
But
in-home healthcare services.
pretty much, it's different, but the same concept.
So
But for younger people, it would be the state supported living centers.
okay, so you get a call, state supported living center, and this individual says, or someone's responding, it's like, I think there's sexual abuse going on. Okay, that would trigger the 24 hours. Is
Oh
that
yeah,
correct?
oh yeah.
Okay, 24 hours to get an in-person kind of interview going on. So you go and you're talking to someone with limited mental capability, limited communication capability. Walk me through that.
Okay. Essentially, in a sexual abuse case specifically, we we pull any strings we can to get law enforcement out there because law enforcement can order a child advocacy center exam or a SANE exam, a sexual assault nursing examination. And if there's an alleged allegation of sexual abuse, and that's what we want to happen and we don't want to do too much to re-traumatize the victim. So I'm probably not going to interview. I'm going to go see the individual probably within a few hours. I'm not going to wait the full 24 hours.
Yeah.
One, to record their demeanor, just to kind of how they're acting, if they're upset. We're in these facilities all the time. So like I know a lot of the individuals and I know how they act normally. And if they're acting different than that, then I can record that and kind of just document what I see. But I'm not going to ask them about the allegation because I don't want to re-traumatize them. A lot of times it's young females, and as male investigators, we would never go into those situations alone or, you know, put ourselves in any sort of compromising situation.
Yeah.
So at that point, we would wait on the SANE exam and
Okay.
kind of follow the determination of that.
Okay. And just for my students, you'll find out about the SANE exam and kind of the stuff that goes along with that when we start looking at autopsies and death studies when you come back from spring break. So we'll get really in specific into that because I'll even refer to it, and Mr. Watts has already did this, refer to it as a second form of trauma
Oh,
because
yeah.
the evidence that you collect on someone who is a sexual assault victim or sexual assault survivor, it's pretty freaking traumatic.
Yeah.
Even if we did it to an individual who has not been assaulted, um, it's not what I'd call a good time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and a lot of times, especially in these facilities, you'll see I don't know if y'all have talked about institutionalization in the prison setting.
Not
Uh,
not very much at all.
Not much. Okay. Well, it also occurs in these state's facilities where you have individuals who have been through an awful lot of trauma and abuse in their lives, and we see a tendency for them to use that trauma to get the things that they want. So, for example, we have a guy at one of the local facilities who loves Dr. Pepper, and he will say that someone raped him to get a Dr. Pepper because he thinks. I know it sounds weird, but he thinks that that's going to get him the things that he wants. So we're very careful in those situations to not just write him off, because we've had cases, and I think I gave one the last time I spoke to your class about a lady in the state hospital who was reporting that the Ghostbusters were raping her. Um,
Yes. Oh, would you retell that story?
Sure, sure. I'll do it. I'll do it in a brief way. I know we have a limited amount of time, but essentially, we got a sexual abuse case at a state hospital where a young lady was saying that the Ghostbusters had raped her, and she had been making this allegation for months, and she had also made a bunch of other false allegations that just were just nonsensical. That someone stole her space boots, and that she couldn't get back to her home planet. I mean, really things that were out there.
Yeah.
And a lot of times as investigators, we have a very dark sense of humor. So we just kind of laugh those things off and say, man, I really hate that this lady is going through these things, because we know that in her head, these are real things that are happening.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out we got a case talking about the Ghostbusters again, and something just wasn't sitting right with me. So I told the investigator, hey, go out there and talk to her and just kind of see what she says, and kind of just ask her some probing questions about this allegation, just to kind of see what she says. So she goes out there, I sent one of my female investigators, and she stated, or she started talking about the Ghostbusters raping her every night at this certain time. And my investigator said, oh, okay, well, what were the Ghostbusters wearing? And she described a tall white male in black scrubs. Well, that's what these uh, psychiatric nursing assistants wear, is black scrubs.
Yeah.
So that like made all of our hearts drop. Like, oh my gosh, maybe something really is going on. Well, it turns out we pulled video for probably 3 months worth of time of the nighttime shift when this lady says this was occurring, and every single time this lady is saying someone came into her room, the Ghostbusters came into her room to rape her. Uh, there was a tall white gentleman in black scrubs going into her room and spending 10 to 15 minutes in there. And every time or just about every time he came out of that room, I don't know if y'all have seen Ghostbusters, but he would turn around and he would say, who are you going to call? So she was connecting Ghostbusters
Oh,
to
wow.
that phrase, who are you going to call? And it turns out we interviewed him, he confessed, and now he's in jail. So it's very important as investigators that we try to put off that perception of, oh, well, they're lying, they're crazy, whatever. We don't treat anybody as crazy. And even if I get 100 calls on someone, we're still required to go through those minimal steps to just find out if there's any validity to the allegation or not.
Yeah.
So that was the case that really woke my entire unit up.
Yeah. So would you say that your case investigates and helps people who in other cases would not be able to help themselves?
Oh, absolutely. Like, yeah, I mean, a lot of the individuals that we work for or advocate for are truly mentally ill. Like, I mean, they do say a lot of nonsensical things, and no one will listen to them. Um, and that's who we're going to see, and we're going to see people in a home setting. A lot of our exploitation cases involves a very small amount of money, but small to you may be everything to them. So like $200, yeah, I would be pretty angry about $200 being stolen, but that could be the difference between someone getting their medication or food in an elderly setting where they have a limited income.
Yeah.
So, and law enforcement is not going to go out and see, not all law enforcement, a lot of law enforcement won't go out and take care of anything like that.
So you're really dealing with people who can't advocate for themselves and
Right.
they've got no other resources, and that you're there to to basically try and save them from whatever issue is
Yeah.
going on.
Yep. That's
All
right.
right. So so now you were investigator, and you were investigator for how many years?
Oh, goodness. Well, I've done a variety of different scopes of investigation, but in this particular field, I was investigator from 2014 to 2018, and I've been a supervisor since. So,
Okay. So what do you so first off, let's say I have a student who wants to get hired with Health and Human Services, with what you do.
okay.
Okay. They want to help people who've not committed a crime. They've been victimized themselves, and they want to help
Right.
people who can't help themselves. What's the first thing they need to do to, say, come to work for an investigative service like yourself?
Okay. Um, well, there are, you have to have a 4-year degree. That's
Okay.
the
Is there a
base.
preference for what kind of 4-year degree?
There is, but it's not necessarily in stone. So, like, for instance, one of my counterparts, who's a very, very good investigator, has a degree in music. Um, so it has nothing to do with our field, but she worked her way up and she got into the door, and she's awesome.
Okay.
My background's in psychology. We have a lot of people whose background is in criminal justice. Um, but a 4-year degree is really essentially all that's required.
Okay. So you got your 4-year degree, you've got some decent grades. What are you looking for when you're hiring an investigator? Like, what are going to be the characteristics
Yeah.
and the qualities that you're looking for when you say, "Hey, I want this person to work these kind of investigations. I think this person would be a good fit for our team."
We do a variety of testing. So we do a lot of personality testing before we even interview you. We would test your personality to see, one, if you have, I know it sounds bad maybe, but if you have the right intellect to ascertain information in a given story. Um, then we have a test that also predicts whether or not you're able to confront people. So, for instance, when we're just talking or whatever, I'm able to pick up on things, or I'm not perfect at it. Nobody is, but I'm able to pick up inconsistencies in people's stories. So if they're walking me through what happened one night, I have to be able to remember those details and what we call pivot points in their conversation where it doesn't sound like they're telling the truth. So there's multiple different types of triggers, but we have a test basically that it's not perfect at it, but it kind of gives you an idea if that person has a reasoning ability to be able to confront people about inconsistencies, because that's
Okay.
what we do a lot.
Okay. So we did this is the first year we did, because of COVID, we did a handwriting analysis class this year,
Mhm.
where we were trying to match up an unknown handwriting sample with known handwriting samples. And so I tell students don't look at the big picture. Always look for those tiny little things that just seem out of place, where, yeah, that A is going to be a different shape, but man, when that A is definitely doesn't seem to follow the same kind of rough pattern, doesn't have to be exact.
Right.
That's where you pay attention. Okay. Is someone copying someone's signature, someone copying someone's style? It's just an indicator that you should probably pay closer attention. Is that kind of
Right.
thing?
Yeah, and an example in ours would be time. So essentially, and this is none of our tactics are foolproof. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about body behavior and people who are guarded like this, and they're talking to law enforcement. It's that they're being dishonest. Well, I get nervous when someone's interviewing me, so I may close up just because I'm nervous, not because I did anything wrong. So we have to be careful to not say, "Oh, they did it," just because they're doing these certain things. But
Yeah.
time is a big one for me. So, like when someone's walking me through a scenario, if they say, if I say, "Okay, and what time was that?" and they tell me it was 6:17 p.m., that's off, because why would they remember that time period? Like, I mean, it doesn't make any sense for that to remember a specific minute. So
So,
when the average person is telling you that story, they would say it happened around 6:15.
okay.
They wouldn't say 6:17 p.m. or whatever. That's not, like I said, that's not 100%, but that's just one of the things I pay attention to when I'm talking to someone.
Okay. All right. So they've taken the test. What other skills you're looking for? Obviously, attention to detail, attention
Yeah.
to, like, hey, can you determine that when something is off?
Writing, we do a writing sample. They have to submit a writing sample to show that they can articulate their thoughts in a organized manner.
Okay.
Because we have a very long report that gets written at the end of every case that kind of outlines our decision-making process and why we feel that the evidence that we've collected leads to this outcome. And I'll just a little quick input here. Whereas law enforcement is required to have a evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, my unit of investigators has to have a preponderance of evidence, which is 51%. It's a very low threshold for proving an allegation. So we don't try to stop at 51%, but we have to have at least 51% to be able to say that something happened or didn't happen. I don't know if that is helpful, but
we generally what I tell my students, and I don't really stick with the numbers so much as I usually say, if you've got a single piece of evidence and you only have a single piece of evidence, your case is crap, and you need to go back and you need to find more evidence or documentation. Because I'm not taking that crap to a grand jury.
Yeah.
You know,
and we're the same way. We don't try to stop at our minimum, but we have to have a minimum, and that's what ours is. But
I mean, I always want to basically, look at both sides of the coin. Okay.
Yeah.
Can your defender defend against this? Can your prosecutor prosecute this? Don't just say, hey, we're all in the right. You do that, you're going to get holes poked in your case left and right.
Yeah. And you can always poke your holes, and I can tell you how many court hearings I've sat in where I'm like, oh man, I can't believe I forgot to do this or that. It's every single person in every single case. But after we look at writing samples, we typically do an interview. We'll do 2 rounds of interviews where it'll be myself and probably a couple other investigators and maybe my boss. And then the next interview would be just me and my boss, who just kind of talks to them about their plans and just sees if they're a good fit for our unit.
Okay. All right. And then, so you hire a new investigator, and then are they going to shadow someone for a year, 6 months?
Oh, goodness gracious. Yeah, the training process is a little bit different now that we have COVID. I haven't trained anyone. Thankfully, my unit is pretty solid. But there's it's probably 6 months to a year. Well, probably closer to 6 months. But you're not just thrown into the fire and said, oh, okay, hey, go investigate. No, you're walked through the process. A lot of virtual classes now that we have COVID. So before they would go to Austin for 3 weeks and they would be trained by very skilled investigators there who know how to train people very well. But there's hundreds of training classes that they can take, and there are certain required basic training classes that they have to take before they can investigate.
Yeah.
And then they're also assigned a shadow worker who kind of walks them through the process, and they're allowed to follow and kind of copy.
Okay. All right. And so, you've got this investigator, they're hired, and after 6 months to a year, they're on their own. And then they're basically, do you have a constant backlog of cases, or do you ever run out of cases, or is there always a need?
Oh, no. I don't know of a time that we've ever run out of cases. In fact, there's backlogs of cases in a lot of areas. Not in my area, thankfully, but we always have work to do. And the investigators never really own their own. We operate like a very tight unit and we're like family. So if my investigators need something, they call me and I'm there. I cover 34 counties, and I'll go to any one of them to help them out if I need to. So I went to state hospital the other day and had a hazmat suit on to go in there and interviewed a sexual assault perpetrator for one of my investigators the other day. So it's not fun, but it's just part of it, and it's important. So
all right.
They're never hung out to dry or anything.
Okay. So so you've done your time in the field, you've been your investigator, and now you're a overseer or a director for investigators. So what's your next step, Mr. Watts?
I think I'm going to run for governor. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I like what I'm doing right now. It's changing at the moment, so it's kind of weird, I guess.
Is it changing because of COVID, or is it changing because of?
Oh, no. Well, up until about a year ago, we were not with the Health and Human Services Commission. We were with the Department of Family and Protective Services. So we've been moved out from this smaller umbrella agency to a larger umbrella agency that works. We still have directors and assistant commissioners and all that good stuff, but we're closer to the governor than we were when we were with DFPS. So it's just a different hierarchy, and they do things a little bit different. So it's
The
just an
investigator-
adjustment period.
But the investigators basically have the same job.
Oh yeah, my investigators have the exact same job.
Their job has not changed. It's more of a matter
Right.
of what's
Who
happening,
our boss is different.
who your boss is. Okay. So I know this is going to be one of the standard questions. Do you make good money doing what you do? Because my students will always ask this.
That's a great question, and honestly, it's important because you need to be able to survive when you get out. I don't remember the starting pay, but I know that it's in the mid 40s. So, and then I know there are people my level and above making close to 100,000. So,
Okay.
not you can make more money in the private sector. I would tell you that it's not a career you get into for the money, but there's money. I mean, it will provide a nice living for you. So yes,
And the state insurance for
absolutely, and
is
retirement.
yeah.
Yeah,
Insurance and retirement is very solid when you work for a state agency. It's a little not as great as a teacher.
yeah. Well, I was going to say I think everybody's insurance has gotten progressively worse over the years, but I think as far as insurance comparisons go, it's one of the best.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Mr. Watts, we've used up about as much time as I got for a class, maybe a little bit more. So do you have any last minute words of advice or any other stories you want to tell us real quick?
I really don't. The only thing I would tell you is when you're picking a career, pick something that you can be passionate about and not something that just pays you a paycheck, because satisfaction I have found over the years in what I do is much more important than the paycheck. Paycheck is important, don't get me wrong, but if I don't wake up every day and feel like I'm contributing something to this world or doing something for someone who can't do for themselves, then me personally, I'm not interested. So that's why I'm in it. And I would hope that anybody that decides to join in this field would feel the same way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Watts.
Yes, sir. Y'all have a good one.